So thank you everyone for joining us for today's webinar on the revised Waste Framework Directive proposed by the European Commission. Today will certainly serve as an opportunity for you to learn more about and also ask questions about this EU proposal, which, as you can see from even the title of the webinar, focuses on food waste and textile waste reduction. By way of introduction, I am Gabriel, the MBB's Policy Manager for Sustainability Files. So my role here is to follow EU policy developments on sustainability, gather feedback from businesses such as yourselves, and also represent your interests at the EU level. And I will also be moderating today's session. With me, I have MBB President Alison Mitzi to deliver the opening address and kickstart our webinar. We will also be joined by MHRA CEO Andrew Muscat, who will share his views on this proposal from the perspective of hospitality, of course. We will also welcome Gabby Grech-Larsen, Policy Executive from the Malta Chamber on Sustainability, who will share what support the Malta Chamber may offer businesses to reduce the environmental impact of their operations, especially through the Enterprise Europe Network service. Those of you who would like to ask questions throughout the session are obviously encouraged to either use the chat or the Q&A feature integrated directly within Teams. Or if you prefer, you can also use the raise hand feature of Teams, and we will then enable your microphone and camera so you can state your question. There will also be a dedicated Q&A part at the end of the session where we will go through all of your comments and questions. Now I leave the floor to MBB President Alison Mitzi for her opening remarks.
Hi, good morning, everyone, and thank you for making the time to join us for this webinar to raise awareness on the important EU proposal for the revised Waste Framework Directive. Today's discussion will specifically focus on two measures which are focusing on the reduction of textile waste and food waste. For those joining us for the first time, the Malta Business Bureau is the organization that represents the Malta Chamber and the Hotel and Restaurants Association in Brussels and Malta on EU matters. It aims to inform the Maltese business community about EU policy and legislative developments, while also tries and gathers opinion directly from the businesses, from the local businesses, to convey these messages to the representatives at EU level during the negotiation process. This could include, for example, the Maltese government, MEPs, European Economic and Social Committee, and our wider network of business organizations such as Eurochambre or Business Europe. The topic of the day, that is the revised Waste Framework Directive, is considered a key step to tackle two areas, as I already mentioned. So far, these are considered as lagging behind, and they contribute significantly towards global waste and environmental degradation. The MBB has extensive experience in working particularly on food waste and through successful initiatives such as, for example, the Life Foster project, which focused on education and dimension, and the Business Against Food Waste campaign, which offered awareness-raising sessions for staff. Food waste is a major contributor to climate change, both directly and indirectly. It is typically landfilled or treated, producing significant greenhouse gas emissions, whichever path is chosen. Food waste also represents a major cost to the EU economy, with current EU estimates standing at losses of €132 billion per annum. Such costs are consequently borne by businesses, government, consumers, and taxpayers alike. In terms of textile waste, they are equally alarming, and data shows that the EU generates 12.6 million tons of textiles waste each year. Almost half of this amount is attributed to clothing and footwear waste alone. At the same time, only 22% of this waste is collected for recycling or reuse. In this context, there is a genuine business case behind reducing food and textile waste beyond their environmental benefits. By minimizing waste, businesses can achieve significant cost savings, enhance operational efficiency, and foster a more sustainable approach. This not only contributes to the bottom line, but also resonates with the growing consumer demand for environmentally responsible practices. At the same time, the European Commission's draft proposal includes questionable measures, such as selecting 2020 as the baseline year to measure food waste reduction. This, in our mind, ignores the economic and social circumstances brought about by the COVID-19 pandemic that year. As with many industries, hospitality suffered from repeated and prolonged periods of closures or other restrictions on their operations. Therefore, these restrictions render any food waste data gathered during this period as inaccurate, as it does not reflect the real-world scenario where hospitality establishments encounter during normal periods. Over the course of today's session, we will delve into the specific of the proposals and discuss its implication for our businesses. I thus encourage active participation from your end and invite you to share any questions or comments that you may have. I wish you a fruitful and healthy discussion and look forward to listening to the contributions of today's speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alison, for setting the scene and introducing today's topic. Now it's time for my presentation, which will briefly go over the main points of the proposal, so we can all familiarize ourselves with what the Commission is putting forward. So I hope you can see my slides. Someone obviously please tell me if they're not visible. So starting off with some general information concerning the revised Waste Framework Directive. Obviously, this is replacing a directive which already exists. So the Waste Framework Directive is already a law which is established in the EU and transposed in all member states. And it is extremely important because it establishes certain fundamental principles and definitions concerning waste, which we tend to use on an everyday basis and help us understand what we mean by these terms. For example, it defines what constitutes waste, what is recycling, what is recovery. And it also, very importantly, enshrines the so-called waste hierarchy in EU law, which we will see in the next slide. And I'm sure many of you are already familiar with it. The important point about this revision is that it aims to place a greater emphasis on the reduction of textile waste and food waste, which Alison has already mentioned are two sources of waste which so far have not been tackled as seriously as perhaps other sources of waste, but at the same time they lead to a lot of costs and environmental damage. So they are extremely important to reduce. This is the waste hierarchy, which I mentioned. As I said, probably many of you are familiar either with the diagram or with what it is trying to represent. The idea here is that waste management in the EU should always try to aim for the best possible scenario, which is the prevention of waste. It is always better to prevent waste from being generated than generating waste and trying to figure out what to do with it. So the best possible scenario would be waste prevention. And this is where the idea of waste reduction comes from, like food waste reduction. And obviously the worst case scenario is disposal, which basically means throwing the waste into landfills and letting it sit there for indefinitely or for a period of time. Now, starting off with food waste, we're seeing that this proposal for the very first time has introduced binding targets which all member states must meet by the end of 2030. So basically, we are seeing two sets of targets. The first one is a 10% reduction in food waste in manufacturing and processing, and a 30% reduction in food waste jointly in retail, distribution, restaurants and food services, and households. Importantly to note here is that these targets will be measured, as Alison mentioned in her speech, against a baseline year of 2020. We can already start anticipating what the problems are with this year, but perhaps it could also come up in the discussion later in this webinar. But obviously 2020 is one of the key peak COVID years. So it is questionable how reliable this data will actually be. Important also to note is that the European Parliament has already issued its position on this file. So as with many EU proposals, both the Parliament and the Council have to issue their own respective positions, which then will be negotiated. And the Parliament is proposing to raise these targets even further to 20% for manufacturing and processing and 40% to retail, restaurants and food service and households. Now, I just wanted to include this slide for you to get a bit of an understanding of how food waste is split in the EU according to different sources. And as we can see from the dark blue section, over 50% of food waste is actually in the EU is actually generated by households. And if you look at, for example, restaurants and food services, the figure is much lower, standing at around 9 to 10%. So here it gives you a bit of an understanding of where the main sources of food waste lies and where the intervention would be most appropriately placed. In terms of the main resources that member states would have in their arsenal to tackle food waste, according to the proposal, it lists mainly 4 aspects. The first part, I guess, is always a starting point, is supporting behavioral change and raising awareness. Then there's also addressing inefficiencies in the functioning of the food supply chain. Perhaps there is wastage in the production and the preparation, or wastage in the transportation of food or in the storage of food. Then there is also the aspect of encouraging food donation and redistribution. This obviously has to be coupled with also appropriate measures concerning food hygiene and what food can be donated and not donated. And also there's the final aspect concerning training and skills development, and also access to funding opportunities, which obviously is a benefit to businesses, and which is something to be reacted towards positively. That is the part on food waste. Obviously, it is quite a short section, but it still is important, has several implications. Now, moving on to textile waste. As I mentioned, this is also another very important area of waste and sources of waste within the EU, which so far hasn't been tackled as seriously. But now we are seeing that the EU is tackling the issue of food waste by focusing on virtually any company which could potentially put textiles on the market for the first time. So this could be either the manufacturers of the textiles, the resellers and the distributors, for example, any other operators who could be involved in putting these products on the market, and also operators who are selling these products by means of distance communication. So, for example, online selling, even if they are established outside of the EU. So obviously, this is quite a wide understanding of what companies fall within scope of this proposal. The main point which the proposal is introducing to tackle textile waste is the introduction of an extended producer responsibility applying to certain classes of products which are sold as new in the EU. Importantly to note is that this tackles only new products, so second-hand products do not fall within scope of this proposal. What we mean by extended producer responsibility basically is just a fancier term to say the polluter pays, for example, in this case, or the waster pays. Now, the EU has started to look at 4 main types of textile waste categories. So you have household textiles, apparel, clothing, accessories, and also footwear. The main reason why these textiles categories were chosen is that they represent the vast majority of textile waste in the EU, so it would make sense to start from these before expanding to further classes of products. But we can already see, for example, that the European Parliament is pushing to expand this list even further. So obviously, pending the final negotiations, these are the categories of products that we are looking at. Obviously, if you look at the actual proposal, then in the annex, it actually lists in extensive detail specific products by name, but they could be grouped together under these 4 headings. Now, under this extended producer responsibility, producers would be expected to cover the costs of aspects relating to, for example, collecting used textiles, carrying out compositional surveys of the collected municipal waste, providing information on sustainable and circular practices, data gathering, and also supporting research and development. Importantly to note here is that these costs will be eco-modulated. And what this means, basically, the costs that producers are expected to pay will be adjusted depending on how sustainable their products are. So the more sustainability is ingrained in the way the producer produces and manages its textiles, the less the EPR contribution is expected to be. So here it's an incentive for textile producers to really focus on the sustainability of their products. Now, another obligation placed on producers will be to set up free collection systems for their used and waste textiles, which fall obviously within the scope of the proposal. And this will run alongside a separate collection system, which governments themselves have also need to set up by 1st January 2025. So customers here would have an option either to use the collection systems operated by the producers themselves or the sellers themselves, for example, or the public, so to speak, collection systems operated by governments. Now, producers will also be expected to increase the information that they are provided to consumers, especially online information. And this should relate to aspects such as the number of products that they are placing on the market in that year, the rates of separate collection, and also the rates of reuse, recycling, recovery, disposal, and exports of these waste. The idea here is that producers increase their accountability and transparency of what is actually happening with the waste textiles that they are putting on the market, but also collecting. Member states from their side also need to set up a register of producers in order to keep track of what producers are active within that member state, to also keep track of who should be paying the accepted producer responsibility costs, who should be providing this online information and keeping track of all these obligations, basically. On the other hand, also, member states can also charge producers a proportional fee to be included into this register. The fee should basically cover the costs of running the register and should not be a profit-making exercise, essentially. That is the end of my presentation. Obviously, it is quite a short proposal. Basically, it's just a couple of pages, but obviously it has quite wide-reaching implications. It is a new concept for perhaps locally and even at the EU level to introduce such targets and such measures to tackle both food waste and textile waste. So, as I mentioned, at the end of the session, we will have a dedicated Q&A part to answer any questions that you may have and also receive your comments and feedback. But now, before I would like to move on to MHRA CEO Andrew Ajus-Muscat's intervention to share the perspective of the MHRA as the association representing hotels and restaurants in Malta. Let me check, Andrew. And Andrew, are you with us in the call?
Gabriel.
Yes, we can see you. Thank you, Andrew.
Hi, good morning. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Gabriel, for the presentation. No, just a small intervention. We from the hospitality industry, we traditionally have been taking care of food waste because that falls exactly within the profession of caterers. Just give me a second. Hassan, just tell them. Apologies because today I'm off and I'm on a construction site. So basically, as I was mentioning, the catering industry is traditionally known for the management of food waste because at the end of the day, it forms part of the profession itself because food also costs money. So in preparing menus, in preparing your offerings, one needs to take care into how to organize the food element itself. No need to mention that today, more than ever before, the cost of food is becoming increasingly higher due to the inflation that we're facing across at an international level. So it comes fitting from our end to use more our brains to see how we can better manage food waste. Of course, when something comes imposed on us, especially from institutions like the European Union, we need to be well informed so that we can see how we can align our operations to what the supranational institutions are requiring. So we are following such developments closely thanks to MBB. And we'll be keeping you updated about the latest developments as we're doing today with the presentation of Gabriel. Thank you so much, Gabriel.
Okay, thank you, Andrew, for what I would say is a nice summary of the implications of the proposal that will bring for Horeca and Horeca's relationship with food waste. As you're saying, it's already sort of a priority, even beyond this proposal, since they're in the industry of food, so to speak. I would now like to move on to the Malta Chamber Policy Executive on Sustainability, Gabby Grech-Larsen, who, as I said, will discuss how the Malta Chamber is supporting businesses to become more sustainable through the Enterprise Europe Network. Gabby, the floor is yours.
Hi, good morning, everyone. As Gabriel said, my name is Gabby Grech-Larsen, and I work within the policy team at the Malta Chamber. My main areas that I'm sort of in charge of are water and energy, circular economy and waste, sustainable mobility and transport, ESG, and sustainability issues in general. Gabriel and I, or MBB and us, work very closely together. Of course, basically taking into consideration the business aspects of every or most of the European regulations and directives that are trickling down into Malta, which is quite a huge job. And on this note, obviously, what is important to mention before I go into the next part of what I want to tell you about is that we really appreciate when our members come back to us with feedback, because with your feedback, we can actually give feedback to the EU on things that count for our businesses. Without this, a lot of the consultations will end up not with the substantiated evidence that we need. So the more you can give us feedback, and when you see us reaching out, I know that we can be a bit overwhelming sometimes with all the things that we're asking for, but this is ultimately to be able to create a better system for us here in Malta in order to be able to adapt to many of these regulations that are trickling down. What I wanted to speak to you about today basically is Enterprise Europe Network. So the Malta Chamber, together with MBB and another 2 consortium partners, are the local representatives for the European Enterprise Network. And in that role, we have, for example, MBB, who help with access to finance, Malta Enterprise help with digitalization, MCST on research and development, and the Malta Chamber is in charge of sustainability advisory services. Obviously, as we know, the movement towards more sustainable practices is really surging at the moment. There are the cascading effects of all the EU regulations. There's a growing recognition of physical and transitional impacts of climate change, biodiversity loss, unsustainable resource depletion, and the EU trying to address all of these concerns from different levels. At the same time, we also have seen a growing demand both from our customers, from employees, from investors. Everybody is moving in that direction. So in a sense, there is a double pressure, which is coming one from the private sector and one which is also coming from the regulatory aspects. Obviously, the transition to sustainability is not a simple one, as probably most of you are aware. You're trying to grapple with all these different things that are being imposed, so to speak, and make the best out of it. And on that note, I really want to kind of underscore the importance of seeing it also as an opportunity. While some of them can be might require quite a hefty investment, some other items of your sustainability transition will create huge opportunities also in financial terms. From from the side of the Malta Chamber, the way that we work in this case through EEN is that we would go out to companies who request our services, and we will help them to get an idea of where they have reached so far in their sustainability journey. It could be 0, it could be 50, it could be you're well on the way. The idea is to do an assessment in order to create a bit of an action plan. So we would see the material topics for your business, depending on which sector you're operating in, and we would come up with ideas of how you could improve your sustainability. It could be energy related, water related, waste related, you name it. There is no sort of direction in specific that we will go in, but we will discuss this together, come up with an action plan, and hopefully then you will start implementing these measures. I wanted to mention in this regard that where I'll be having an information session next Tuesday between 9 and 10 o'clock, where I will be explaining EEN in a bit more detail, speaking about sustainability in general, sustainability transitions, and the opportunities that you can reap from it. And also what I will be speaking about is EE Energy, which in a nutshell is a grant which is currently available that SMEs can apply for, which is aimed towards improving your energy efficiency. There's up to €10,000, and it's sort of a randomized selection process, but the application is quite simplified. There isn't a requirement for submitting several different quotations for services that you need. You basically need to identify some goals that you'd like to achieve through your sustainability advisor and then apply accordingly. So if there is anyone who is on this call who is an SME, who is wishing to transition their business towards more sustainable practices, feel free to contact me. Maybe, I don't know, Gabriel, if you can maybe put my email address in the chat, or so that people can contact me if they'd like to, and I can also then give you details about the webinar that I'll be holding next Tuesday. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out, and I think that's from my end.
So, thank you, Gabby, for the good overview, I would say, of what how the EEN can help, as we like to say. In that case, if you have any online information, maybe a link to register, maybe you can leave it in the chat, Gabby, and people in the call can access it right away. But obviously, we can also share your contact details within the chat if anyone has any specific questions they would like to ask about the EEN service that the Malta Chamber can offer. Obviously, I encourage, as Gabby said, anyone who is interested in these services to get in touch. MBB, as Gabby said, is also a proud member of the EEN service, and essentially we're all here to support you. Yeah. Now we can move on to the final part of the session to answer any of your questions or comments. I already see 2 comments in the Q&A part, and please, if anyone else has any comments or questions, please come forward and we'll be happy to address them. Seeing first comment by Marine Tizon from HOTREC. Just as a very brief introduction, HOTREC is the EU Pan Association representing hospitality associations across the EU. MBB is a member on behalf of MHRA, and we collaborate obviously with like-minded associations on EU policy matters affecting businesses, not just on sustainability, but also on other areas, including digitalization, for example. And Marine is basically saying that there is a suggestion to change the baseline year to be calculated on 2022 instead of 2020. So here, as we mentioned, the issue with 2020 is that it was a peak COVID year. Many hospitality establishments were closed or operating at limited services, and this means that the level of food waste that they were generating within their operations is probably not accurate and not in line with what they would generate in a normal year. So the suggestion here is to move it to 2022. Obviously, 2022 still, at least in Malta, we still had certain restrictions, but it was a better situation, certainly, than 2020 and 2021. So if anyone has any reactions to this suggestion, please obviously raise your hand or leave a comment in the chat, and we'll be happy to carry on this discussion. I'm also seeing another question about whether farmers fall within the scope of this proposal. I imagine this relating obviously to the food waste aspect. What I can say is that obviously the Commission had considered the inclusion of a target on primary production, and primary production includes agriculture and farming. But in the final proposal, the Commission decided to leave out a specific target on primary production. But again, even MEPs in the European Parliament position have suggested that further down the line, in a couple of years, this should be reassessed with a view of potentially including a separate target to tackle primary production, which I said would necessarily include farming and agriculture. This would cover not just, according to the Parliament's suggestion, not just food which is harvested but not sold, but also food which is unharvested and left in the field. Any other comments or questions? Please, now is the time to come forward. If there are no further comments, that would bring us to the end of today's webinar. Our email addresses and contact details are available online and even on the registration form. So if you have any other comments that you'd like to put forward, even on a one-to-one basis, or things which come to mind after this session, please do let us know, and we'll do our best to facilitate and provide further clarity. I would like to thank, first of all, today's speakers for their contributions and for finding the time to join us and to share their perspectives on this file, and also how they could help members. Gabby has just left her contact details in the chat, so if anyone interested in the EN service or the information session which she mentioned, please check that out. Obviously, I would also like to thank all of you for attending and for finding the time in your busy schedules to follow this webinar. And I wish you all a nice day and a nice weekend ahead. Thank you.